Yep.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. It's great to be back. I'm from Cincinnati, as the bio sort of gave away, because no one chooses the root for the Cincinnati Bengals, unless you're born there. So it's great to be back. I kind of volunteered myself to come here and invited myself. I gave a talk at University of Louisville on Monday, and then a talk in Indianapolis Tuesday, and I've got a talk in Ohio University, my alma mater, on Friday, and then West Virginia University on Monday. So I'm kind of on a junket through the Ohio, Indiana, and I've eaten Skyline chili every day since I've been here. It's great. Again, thanks for coming. As the title of the book suggests, Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. This is not an academic press book. I should tell you a little bit about my regular job. I'm a professor of economics at Southern Methodist University. I run a center. I write journal articles. I've written a large number of them. The nice thing about journal articles, or the sad thing about journal articles, is you spend 2 years working on one. It takes a year for it to get published, and then you realize that maybe 10 people read it, and 8 of them were your friends. My co-author, Ben Powell, Ben is a little younger than me, but he's a professor. He runs the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. And he's similarly pretty accomplished as an academic, and he has the same problem that no one reads his books or articles either. So we were talking over beers. That's what Ben and I usually do when we're together. And we said, you know, we should write a popular audience book, a pop book. And that's what this became. The publisher describes it as, forgive the language, but the publisher describes it as the bastard stepchild of Anthony Bourdain and Milton Friedman. We were going for the style of writing, the fun, lighthearted style of writing that Anthony Bourdain had in his books, writing those. But we wanted the topic is going to be socialism, which is a deadly serious topic. We wanted the economics of Milton Friedman, but the style of Anthony Bourdain. So that's what the book is. It's a popular audience book. It's completely unlike anything I've ever written until this project. This is the first sort of book I've tried to write where we're trying to be funny, trying to be lighthearted, trying to be actually enjoyable to the reader. You know, that the reader actually enjoyed reading it, which is something you don't really care about when you're writing a journal article. So let's talk about the book. I don't want to pile on so-called millennials, but you may have seen the polls. That something like 40, I've even seen a recent poll that said 50% of young people have a favorable opinion of socialism. We have presidential candidates now, Bernie Sanders. We have elected officials, public officials in the United States like AOC, who use the word socialism out loud, and they're actually popular, at least with large numbers of people. So something has happened in the last, 15, 20 years, where socialism has become popular with young people and with certain populations who are catering to that audience. Here we have Michael Moore, the famous filmmaker, and he says most young people across America prefer socialism, which he thinks means fairness, and over capitalism, which he defines as selfishness. And so right there's a little bit of confusion, because to me, I'm a professor of economics. I've written this Economic Freedom of the World Index. My job for the last 30 years has been to study economic systems. It confuses me to hear someone describe socialism as fairness and capitalism as selfishness. That's not the definition I would use in any of my journal articles that no one reads. So the first step we're going to have to do is sort of define our terms. Let's talk about what socialism is. This is the title. This is the chapters in the book. The first chapter is called Not Socialism, Sweden. Then we go to Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and then we end up back in the USSA. It's a little play on the Beatles song. So that's the outline of the book. Let me talk about the first chapter, Sweden. Its title is Not Socialism. There's a picture of Ben and I a few years ago in Stockholm with our colleague Brad Hobbs. He's a professor at Clemson now. We're drinking in front of Duval Cafe. Duval Cafe is in Stockholm. It's a privately owned bar. I don't know who the owner is, but I know it's not it's not the government of Sweden. It's a privately owned bar. It's a for-profit enterprise. The beer was very good. In fact, it was Belgian beer, Duval. It was very expensive, but that's a private bar. That's not a state-owned enterprise. And the definition of socialism that I've always used, the definition that Marx used, that Lenin used, that pretty much every socialist until very recently used, is socialism is when we abolish private property and we collectivize the means of production. The land, the labor, and the capital, the stuff that we use to make things with, the resources we use to make things, is collectively controlled, not privately controlled by individual owners. Socialism is collective ownership and control of resources. And in fact, in practice, that is typically meant government ownership and control of resources. In Sweden, if you use that definition, is clearly not socialist because the Swedish government doesn't own a lot of, in fact, they don't own any companies really. Volvo, the famous car maker, they're a private firm or for-profit firm. The prices in the Swedish economy are completely unregulated prices. They have, just like, more or less like the United States. There is one difference between a country like the United States, which is also a market economy. Sweden is a market economy. It's not a socialist economy. Their taxes are about 50% higher than our taxes. But you are free, the Swedish business people are free to make their own decisions. They produce what they want to produce. They sell their products to consumers at prices that they agree on with those consumers. They sell to global markets. They have imports into Sweden. It is a free market economy of the sort, except on tax day where they take a fairly healthy chunk of your income. And that's the thing. But that's not socialism. That's a market economy with high taxes. And so the first part of the book is we go through basically a definition story. All right, and we use Sweden as our example. In the Economic Freedom Index that I co-author, when the book was done, Sweden was the 27th rated most free economy out of 162. And that's not a socialist economy. All right, so today Bernie Sanders will sometimes point to Sweden as socialist economies. And I wish he would stop saying that. If he wants Sweden, if he just wants higher taxes, that's fine. That's another argument. But it's not a socialist economy. In fact, the Swedes really get mad when American politicians point at them and call them socialists. Because they're like, we're not socialists. We're a market economy like you guys are. Our taxes are higher, but basically we're like you. So that's the first part of the book, is getting that out of the way. Real socialism means the state's going to control the means of production. And that has been tried in a lot of different places. And we wanted to then travel to some of these places. So this is a travel book. Ben and I actually traveled to Venezuela. Actually, we started in Colombia. We flew to Bogota, and we went to another city. We flew to a second city in Colombia called Cucuta. Cucuta is on the Venezuelan border. It's about a 600,000 or 800,000 person city. It's a major city in Colombia. It borders Venezuela, and you can see there's two sets of bridges crossing over a small river between Venezuela and Colombia. And every day when we were there, every day, tens of thousands of Venezuelans, literally, no exaggeration, tens of thousands of Venezuelans cross from Venezuela into Colombia to go to places like this to buy rice, beans, and sugar, aspirin, deodorant, shampoo, diapers, whatever. They're going to the grocery store. On the way in, well, on both ways, you see they're carrying big bags as a father and his young son. The father's got two luggage on wheels and a big backpack. His son has a couple backpacks himself. You would see these families coming in with bags. And the interesting thing is, on the way into Venezuela, the bags were heavy. You could tell that they were struggling to carry them. They were dragging these heavy bags. On the way in, it was confusing at first. Anybody know what was in the bags on the way in to Colombia, the way out of Venezuela? Cash. So Venezuela has had hyperinflation for several years now. Last year's inflation rate in Venezuela was 80,000% for the year. Ben, this is a little dark picture here. Ben is holding about that much Venezuelan currency, and mostly in 100 Bolivar notes, which is the highest denomination that they had available, 100 notes. That amount of money that he has in his hands, about this much if you stacked it up, that's about $8 in US terms. So if you were going to have $100, you would need a stack of Venezuelan currency as tall as me. If you were going to buy a car, you would need like a small room full of cash, right? In fact, the money changers on the streets that were changing the Venezuelan currency into the Colombian currency, the pesos, the money changers don't even count the Venezuelan money. They weigh it with a scale. It's faster that way. All right. So they've had hyperinflation. The government of Venezuela is broke. They've collectivized most of the agricultural sector. The government has taken over the farming sector, particularly large industrial farms. They have nationalized the oil industry and most of the heavy industries in the country. They didn't nationalize hotels and restaurants. They're actually they're drilling down their socialism to even the smallest level enterprises. And food production is cratered. As typically the case when you socialize agriculture, those farmers who are working for the state aren't nearly as productive as they were when they were farming their own farms. And food production has fallen dramatically in Venezuela. And they don't have the money to buy imports because they don't have a lot of hard currency now. And so they print money, and it just causes the inflation. So these are just some photos here. Now, we talked to one couple. I like to talk about Paulo and Ana Maria. Paulo and Ana Maria, they had driven 3 days. We interviewed them on the streets on one of these bridges. Oh, that's better, thanks. Paulo and Ana Maria had driven 3 days from Ciudad Bolivar, which is a city on the other side of Venezuela, almost on the Guyana border. And so on the far eastern side of Venezuela, they had come to the far western side, to the Colombian border. 3 days, so it's going to be a 6-day round trip. And they left their child at home with relatives. So they left their child at home and they drove the equivalent of like from here to Vancouver or something to go to Kroger. It's a 6-day round trip. And these were not poor people. They were not peasants. They had a car. Paulo worked in a hotel. He spoke a little bit of English, although we did most of our conversation in Spanish. They weren't peasants. I've seen a lot of world poverty in my time. I've traveled to all 60 countries. I've seen the world's worst poverty in the slums of India, Africa. Indonesian poverty is the worst I've ever seen. And you should never, ever get used to poverty. When you see people who are really desperately poor, you should never get used to that scene. It should always bother you. You should always try to figure out how we can fix this problem. But this was not what this was. This wasn't poverty in the normal sense that we have in this world. We have too much of that. But this was middle-class people. And sometimes even upper-class people. I remember that couple specifically. He arrived in a yellow taxi, which meant he was rich, because if you could afford a yellow taxi, you're a pretty rich person. So this was a rich person by Venezuelan and Colombian standards. But what was he doing? He was doing the same thing that the regular people were doing. He was going all the way to Venezuela to buy groceries. So that was probably the most dystopic scene I've ever seen. It's like where a civilized society basically crumbles and people are reduced to doing things that just don't make sense. I can't imagine how bad my life would have to be for me to leave my young child here, say in Richmond, and then drive to Vancouver to get food. That is a sort of almost I can't even almost contemplate how desperate I would have to be for that kind of decision to make sense. So that was our trip to Venezuela. We call it starving socialism. The average, even according to the government, the average Venezuelan has lost about 35 to 40 pounds. Now, some of us could lose a few pounds and we'd be happy about it, but the whole country didn't go on Jenny Craig. This was a country that is literally not able to feed itself. And so that was our trip to Venezuela. We did go into Venezuela as well, but most of the action, most of the really interesting economics, most of the interesting stuff we were able to see was actually on the Colombian side of Venezuela. Coming over, you go to the Venezuelan side, there's nothing over there, and it's actually not very safe either. So we didn't spend a lot of time in the Venezuelan side. Let's go to maybe the best case. It's not a very good case, but it's the best case. Of all the countries that today are still socialist, really there's only three. Venezuela is one, North Korea is the other, we'll get to that in a minute, and Cuba is the only one. All the other ones that you were socialist have kind of given it up. But today's world, basically three countries are still actively trying to be socialist, and Cuba is maybe the best case. We called it subsistence socialism. When you arrive there, it feels like any other sort of Caribbean island. If you've ever been to the Caribbean, it's sort of like that. It's hot and humid, it's not super nice, but it's not super awful either. The first night we stayed in a government-run hotel. This is the Hotel Trinton. Actually, this is a picture of the Hotel Trinton. When it opened in 1979, the Soviet Union built this gleaming 2 towers, white, nice, pretty picture. This is what the Hotel Trinton looks like today. In fact, it's hard to see, but almost every window, from about halfway up the tower, almost every window is broken. Of the 4 elevators, 3 of them were not working, and we were on the 10th floor. We had to lug our luggage up, and there was no lights in the stairway. I remember having to lug our luggage up 10 stories in the heat of Cuba, and we were just sweating like crazy, not very happy people at the Hotel Trinton. And when you got into the rooms, you found this. This is actually 2 different government-run hotels put together, but you can see the missing tile. It's actually hard to see the absolute horrible molds everywhere in the thing. This is a glass that came out of sterilized, but you can see this disturbing stain on the glass. I don't know what that is. It was very nice that they left us the soap from the previous guest. And Ben and I came home after a night of drinking, and he sat on the toilet, and if you'll notice that toilet, that bolt on the seat isn't there, so he sat down and he sort of flew off and said some very funny words that I can't repeat here. And then, towels. So the hotels in Cuba, the government-run hotels, are truly awful. And the reason they're awful shouldn't surprise you. What happens to the Hotel Trinton? I think the other hotel is called the Hotel Caribe. What happens to these hotels if they don't do a good job?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing happens to them. They will be in business next year and the year after that. This is a state-owned enterprise. Whether they make money, don't make money, whether they give you clean towels and new soap, or they don't give you clean towels and new soap, it doesn't matter. And so one of the problems with socialism is when you collectivize the means of production, the people who are doing the production, in this case hotels, they lack incentives to do well. They don't profit if they don't do well, and they don't lose if they don't do well. In contrast, though, starting in 12 or 15 years ago, the Cuban government began to allow private Cubans to rent out rooms in their homes, flats. And you can actually rent them on Airbnb, which is surprising because American credit cards don't work in Cuba. And there's no internet to speak of. But what happens is Cubans in Cuba have relatives in Miami, and the Miami relative will make an account for their flat in Havana or wherever it is in the island. And you'll pay the relatives the money using a U.S. credit card through Airbnb or something. And then they call down to Cuba and say, hey, Bob and Ben will be there on Tuesday, meet them here at this time. So there's a system for that. And that was the way we did one. And the other one, we just sort of arrived in some random city in the southern coast, Trinidad. It's a beautiful old colonial town. And we just arrived somewhere, we walked around, and so the first 500 people asked us, you want a room, you want a room, you want a room? And then finally we got a room for one of them. This room here was in the second city. This was a $25 a night room. This was a $50 a night room. These are both cheaper than the government-run hotels that we were in. Not much cheaper. I think the government was $60 a night, but this was $50 and that was $25. And it's quite nice. Good cold air conditioning, a refrigerator, hot water on both days, which was not something we had in either of the government hotels. We didn't have hot water in either one. And coffee maker. It was quite pleasant. It was as pleasant an Airbnb as I would expect to find in most places in say, the United States. Much cheaper. So there's a real contrast between the government-run hotels, the socialized hotels, if you will, and these newly allowed private hotels. This is kind of the capitalist of the market, not hotels, but they're private rooms. So you see the same difference in government-run versus private restaurants. They're now allowing some private restaurants too. So the two areas of the Cuban economy where people can, there's three areas. One is you can make money in the market economy by renting out rooms. You can make money in a market economy by creating a restaurant in your house. Usually it's like the first floor of a house. They'll just clear out the sort of living room and put up some tables, and that's a restaurant. The other way is to have a car, and I'll talk about the cars in a second. But I want to play another game. So look at this. This is not in the tourist district of Havana. This is in central Havana, not old Havana. Old Havana is where all the tourists go. We went to central Havana. This is where Cubans live, regular people. Anybody see what's kind of wrong with the street? Is there something weird?
No cars?
Well, there are no cars, and that's actually a weird thing. I'll talk about the cars in a second. One of the problems is there's no signs. When you got to a street, you look down the street, it was impossible looking down the street to tell if it was just a residential street where people live, which is not a street that I would want to go down, or a street with many bars and restaurants, which is a street I would like to go down. But from down the street, because there are no signs, right? And everywhere in the world, even the poorest places in the world, there are signs everywhere saying, hey, come to my bar, come to my restaurant, come to my souvenir shop, come, get food here, whatever it is. So one of the difference between a socialist economy like Cuba and just a regular poor economy like Jamaica, one difference became the signage, or the lack of signage in the case of Cuba. Here's a sort of standard little store. There were plenty of stores that I could have shown you. It's actually hard to take pictures because they really don't want you to take photos. You get yelled at and they want to get arrested or anything. So, but this is actually a pretty nicely stocked little store. Anybody see the problem here? So it's not bad. It's like a little 7-Eleven type joint. Yeah, I mean, how many distinct items are available in it? I mean, there's one kind of Coca-Cola. Ben called it Kami Cola. It's the local Cuban-made cola. There's some water. There's about maybe 20 items, distinct items for sale in this store. And this was as good a store as you're going to find. Other stores that we saw had like, you'd have this weird concoction of product mix too. You'd have like cleaning solvent, and then some like pipes, like for like sinks and things, and ladies' underwear, and then it was this strange sort of mix, almost like the world's worst garage sale. This was like a store, you know. So, but the lack of variety is one of the other hallmarks of any socialist economy. Why isn't there more than one kind of Coca-Cola or one kind of cola? The answer is the Cuban government controls the market, and they only make one. There's two types of beer. I'm drinking Cristal right there. There's Cristal and Bucaneros, and at least they give them two kinds of beer. They don't allow imports. So tomorrow there will be two kinds of beer in Cuba. The day after that, two kinds of Cuban. We were there for about 8 days, and believe me, after 8 days of drinking exactly two different types of beer, over and over and over and over and over and over again, you're just like desperate for something different. And of course they have rum, thank goodness, so that works. More or less one kind of rum though. So, and it's not bad rum by any means, but it's just one kind. So this is a private restaurant, it's quite nice. The other thing is that because the government controls the food supply, the restaurants, even the private restaurants, the food wasn't very good. It was kind of bland. Because the Cuban government doesn't make salt, and they don't put any priorities on importing salt. So salt, pepper, any kind of flavor was really hard to come by. All right, I got to talk about the cars in Cuba. It's a little bit of a cliche to talk about the cars in Cuba, but when you first arrive there, I'm an old car guy. I drive a 1968 Volkswagen Beetle almost every day at home. I like cars. I like old cars. I don't even know what kind of American car that is in the background. When you first get there, it's pretty cool. But then you realize it's actually not a Detroit engine anymore. It's a Fiat engine that they shoehorned in there because the Detroit engine blew up 30 years ago. There's no suspension. It's just a really terrible car. No air conditioning. This is actually one of the nicer cars you can find. For a very small amount of time, Cuba imported some French Peugeots and Renaults in the early 90s. Now, why aren't there more cars in Cuba? Is it because of the U.S. embargo? There's no reason the Cubans can't import cars from Mexico or Brazil or Spain or anywhere else. The reason there are no cars in Cuba is because the Cuban government won't allow cars to come into the country. That's why there's so few cars. How much, this is a 1991 Renault. How much do you think that car is worth here in Richmond, Indiana, if you could even find a 30-year-old Renault? That's a $500 beater that you would give to a high school kid who you didn't like your least favorite kid. Here's the car you get, right? This is your kid that messes up. This is the car you get. All right, that car was a piece of, forgive the language, a piece of crap the day it was built. 30 years later, it's worse. It's terrible. It's a terrible car. That car, I'm not exaggerating, that car in Cuba is between $25,000 and $30,000 US dollars. You don't have to be in, what do we teach? First day of economics, supply and demand. What happens if you reduce the supply of cars drastically? Prices rise. So even as poor as Cubans are, they're really poor. Average incomes in Cuba probably are no more than $1,500, $2,000 per person. That car is the equivalent of a $250,000 car in our terms. Right? It's $30,000. Why is it so expensive also? If you own a car, you are de facto a taxi. Everybody who has a car can make money by shepherding people around the city or around the country. So car owners, that's one of the few ways you can earn private money in Cuba. Again, rent out a room, create a restaurant in your house, or own a car and become a taxi, de facto a taxi. It's not a taxi in the sense there's a sign and a meter, but it's a taxi because everybody's waving every car down. And everybody who has a car will stop and take people, and that's how they make side money. It's one of the few ways to make side money. All right, so that's the best case. It's not awful. It's not great either. My tourist advice, if you ever go to Cuba, bring salt. It really is good advice. Bring a small amount of salt because you just want to sprinkle a little bit. It makes the food taste a lot better. It's very, very boring and bland place. Or if you want great Cuban food, go to Miami. The Cuban food is great there. But it's not great in Cuba now. It's not awful. It's not dystopic. I had no moments like I did on the Venezuelan border. People were quite lively and energetic and fun. The music is great. The beer is not a lot of variety, but there's plenty of it. All right. Okay. That's the best case. Let's go to the worst case. Even worse than Venezuela, of course, is North Korea. We went to both South and North Korea. There's probably no greater current contrast between the economic systems in the South and the North. After the Korean War, the North was the rich part. The North was the industrialized part of Korea. The South was the backward, agrarian, poor farmers, peasant farmers, swampland. You know, people in the North make fun of the Southern South Koreans for being backward peasants. The North was the rich place. Of course, that's not the way it is now, because North Korea went to hard Soviet-style socialism, where everything is owned by the state. We did not go into North Korea. Our wives didn't want us to get murdered or imprisoned. So we went to the city of city of Dandong, which is on the Chinese border, the northern North Korea border. And in fact, as anybody, I'll come back to that photo. Many of you have probably seen the satellite photo of the Korean Peninsula. This is the South. Seoul, of course, is right here almost on the border of North Korea. The wonderful lights at night. This is North Korea, essentially no lights at all available, except for the capital city. And then there's the Yalu River, which is the border between China and that city right there, the large lights there, that's Dandong, that's where we went. And Dandong, China is a pretty substantial city. This is Dandong here. It's not Shanghai or Shenzhen or Beijing, but it is a pretty impressive skyline of major skyscrapers running pretty much the entire, as far as you can see, both sides along the river on this side. On the other side of the river is North Korea. So all that stuff over here is North Korea. There's about 600, 500,000 people. It's the major North Korean city. Interestingly, that satellite photo that you see here, that's not a Photoshop. When we arrived, we landed in Dandong at night. We went to the river. This is the river. That's not a light, that's the moon. It's a full moon that night. And you can see there's a couple lights across the river, but basically there's nothing across the river. We were almost worried when we arrived that we'd gone to the wrong city, because we knew there was supposed to be a city across the river, North Korean city across the river, but at night it's completely dark. It's absolutely utter dark. These several 100,000 people on the North Korean side. That big part over there is Korea, the river turns, anyway, is China. Anyway, all those people, they live, it's complete utter darkness. So we didn't have a good chance to talk to North Koreans there, because North Koreans who do escape into China are still illegal, and they can be turned in for a reward. And so Chinese people will frequently basically capture North Koreans who escape and turn them in, and they get rewards for this. And we can only imagine what awaits the North Koreans when they return to North Korea. If they're lucky, they don't get returned. If they're lucky, they get put into sex tourism, which is not great, but worse, maybe going home. So we didn't talk to anyone. We only talked to one North Korean on the border, and she was a legal immigrant. Her parents were actually Chinese, and they actually fled Mao and went to North Korea. You can imagine how bad Mao was, that you would go to North Korea. And then they raised her, but because she's a Chinese national, her parents are Chinese, she was able to legally come to live in China now. And we tried to talk to her, we had an interpreter, but she was just terrified. Ben's a 6-foot redhead. I don't look. We're taller than everybody in the city. We're whiter than everybody in the city, and I'm pretty sure she thought we were spies or something. She was just like we were trying. She was shaking. She was so afraid to talk to us, and so within just a few minutes, we were like, thank you, have a nice day. And we didn't want to upset her any further, or really, we didn't want to get in trouble either, in case it's something that maybe would get her in trouble. So we mostly talked about this Korea in the book. In North Korea, we mostly talked about it from afar. But we got as close as we were willing to get to it. But there it is. And this photo is what you really see. They paint their guard towers kind of Smurf blue. I don't really understand why. They're easy to see though. So this is a guard tower that you can see on the North Korean side of the river. This is the industrial area. There's some rural villages upriver. We went on a boat up and down the river quite a distance. So it's quite dilapidated. One of my favorite stories, it might have actually been this field right here. He's not in the picture. There was this poor farmer. Most of the farmers we saw on these fields were using hand tools or animals, plows with oxen. I saw one tractor, and it was an old diesel tractor. I could hear it even across the river. It had that sort of chuggy sound that old diesel engines make. You know, and there was a little incline on the field, and I could tell that he was trying to go up the hill, this little hill, and it's and he's just not making any ground at all. And eventually, I just felt sad. I really felt for the poor guy. I mean, eventually he gave up and he let it sort of roll backwards down the hill. And so that was just sort of a personal moment. Like, there's this poor guy over there with a 60-year-old tractor, and he was probably one of the most prosperous farmers because he had a tractor. He was not using an ox or using his own human power. So anyway, so let's move on. Those are the three kind of current socialist countries. We have some former socialist countries to talk about. The title of our chapter for China is Fake Socialism. They were absolutely socialist in Mao's time, but after Mao, Deng Xiaoping issued a bunch of market reforms. They decollectivized the farms. They collectivized them under Mao, but they returned the farms more or less to private owners. And private businesses are legal. The market economy flourishes in China, at least most of China now. This is a picture of a street in Beijing. You can see all kinds of Western brands, Gucci watches, The Gap, H&M, department stores. This is a picture from 1990 of Shanghai. This is old Shanghai, the old Western-built Shanghai, old city. Across the way is a slummy dump of swampland and poor people today. This is right here. This is Pudong, which is this area right here. So in 20, 30 years, that has turned into that. So this is fake socialism. Beer became sort of a running metaphor for the book. It's not a beer drinking book, although we have beer on the cover of the book, and Ben and I drink a lot of beer. But beer became sort of a running metaphor. So in Venezuela, they've actually had times where they've run out of beer, eventually stopped production of beer. Cuba only has 2 types. But I knew that China wasn't socialist because the beer was good. In fact, we were drinking Western American craft beers in Dandong, China, not even Beijing. Dandong's a backwater city, really. We were drinking Western craft beers, fancy wheat beers and IPAs and stuff like that they had imported. So, the beer market, the alcohol market could actually tell you a lot about a country. It really is almost it epitomizes the system. So fake socialism, they gave it up. Now it's still a totalitarian political system, right? So they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to politically control the economy with an iron fist while they're trying to let the people be free in their economic lives. That's not a combination that I think is very sustainable, but that's what they're trying to do. Ben and I found out firsthand though, about how totalitarian the Chinese government is. We attended a conference in Beijing. And it was a really cool conference. It was a conference where they were talking about Ayn Rand, the author, philosopher, and Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize. We're in Beijing talking about Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek, 2 of the biggest anti-communists that there have ever lived. And we're talking to Chinese professors and Chinese journalists about the ideas of economic freedom. And it was really neat. The next day, though, the government showed up with thugs, hired thugs. And they padlocked the offices and they kicked the people out of the conference. And that organization, it's called Unirule, no longer exists. They lost their charter about 3 months ago. And Mao Yushi, who's the leader of that organization, is under house arrest. He's been under house arrest for 1.5 years now. So the Chinese government is willing to let the Chinese citizens have the freedom to buy and sell and exchange and start businesses and get rich if they get rich. But they're not willing to let them have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and that's a terrible thing. But anyway, it's fake socialism, though. It's not socialism. Then we went to hangover socialism, not just because Ben and I usually have hangovers when we travel together, but Russia and Ukraine, of course, the Soviet Union, was totally socialist. Collectivized farms, collectivized businesses, no private property except for personal possessions. Even your home, your flat, the home you lived in was state property in Soviet Union times. One of the hallmarks of socialist economies, especially the Soviet Union, is they were famous for their waiting lines. One of the things that the Soviet Union had trouble doing, like all social, they had trouble producing things because people don't like to work for the state very well. They like to work for themselves, but they don't like to work for the state. So they didn't produce a lot of food. They didn't produce a lot of good products. And when products became available, the government also set the prices. And so they set the prices really low. So what happens if you don't make a lot of stuff and then you set prices really low? Well, it's shortages. You get shortages. And so the Soviet Union was just riddled with shortages. And lines would form. Anytime something became available, if butter or cheese arrived at a market, people would form a line to try to get to wait to get in line. And the only line you can see today in Russia, at least that we could see, it was this one right here. This is the line to get into Lenin's tomb in Red Square. They don't charge to get into Lenin's tomb. And so a line forms. It takes about an hour waiting in line, and you walk through and you see the old dead guy, and that's basically the only line that you have. I think they actually should keep this. They should keep Lenin's tomb 0 price, and so that a line always forms, because it's kind of a memory to the Soviet Union time, so to remember what it was like in the old days. My friends from that part of the world, they tell stories that anytime you saw a line, like you just walking down the street and you see people, a bunch of people waiting in line, you would get in the line, and then you'd like, what do they have? what do they have here? Because if it was a line, you got to get in the line. It's the only, they got butter. Oh, good butter, great. And so just waiting in line, you spent large part of your day finding lines, and then if you found one, waiting in it, and hoping that whatever they had for sale was something you actually wanted. We talk about the Soviet Union a lot in this chapter. Obviously, throughout the statistics about Stalin, Lenin, tell the story of the Bolshevik Revolution, things like that. My favorite chapter, though, is the chapter on Georgia, the Soviet Republic of Georgia. I just got back from Georgia again. I've been to Georgia 16 times. I've been going to Georgia every year, sometimes twice a year since 2005. And the title of that chapter is New Capitalism, because Georgia in 2004 began a radical free market experiment. A new president came into Georgia. So they broke apart from the Soviet Union in '91. For the first 10 years, they really didn't do much. But in 2004, they had a sort of second rose, they called it a Rose Revolution. And they hired a new president who was named Mikhail Saakashvili, Misha Saakashvili. And Saakashvili was a sort of a Western-oriented guy. He went to Columbia Law School. He wore Italian suits. He was a very perfect English, very charismatic fellow. I don't think we have a picture of him in here. There's a picture in the book of Misha. And he then hired, as his minister of the economy, a guy named Kaha Bendukidze. This is not going to be on the test, but his name was Kaha. And Kaha was about a 400-pound hulking beast of a human being who cussed and spat and was kind of gross, frankly. I loved Kaha, though. He was a great friend of mine. He died about 2 years ago. But anyway, Kaha is a radical free market guy. And he and Misha Saakashvili transformed the Georgian economy from basically a Soviet republic to, in the Economic Freedom Index that I authored, Georgia in the most recent report was ranked 12th in the whole world, 12th out of 162. 12th most free economy. So from 1991 to today, so basically the span of a single generation, Georgia went from being a Soviet republic to being the 12th most free economy in the world. So this is new capitalism. This isn't hungover socialism or old socialism. This is actual capitalism. And the city is transformed. This is a rural city. It's not very good. But this is us. And continuing with the alcohol story, Georgia's not so great for beer, but it's great wine country. And in Soviet times, the Soviet central planners in Moscow were not complete idiots. They knew that Georgia would be a smarter place to grow wine than, say, Siberia. So they assigned Georgia the task of being the wine-making region for the Soviet Union, and they imported massive amounts of French grapes, Cabernet, other French-style grapes, and they made billions of gallons of, frankly, bad wine, but drinkable wine. And they supplied the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe with Georgian wine, massive amounts of French grapes, French-style making wine, and it was pretty awful. Once the Soviet Union broke apart and Georgia is thrust into a sort of the world economy, guess what happened to that wine business? No one wants to buy that nonsense. It's like not even Gallo good. It's bad wine. And so in the international wine market, there just wasn't enough. And then the people in Georgia, the people in Russia are like, well, I can buy French wine now. They're going to buy French wine. So even bad French wine was better than the old Georgian wine. But here's the good story. Since mostly since the Rose Revolution, Georgia is the oldest winemaking region on earth, they think. They think that this is the beginning of wine, is Georgia. There are 48 different varietals of grape that only exist in Georgia. And there's a winemaking style, it's a little bit primitive, it's an old world style of making wine where they basically have clay pots. There's a clay, it's hard to see, but that's what it looks like. It's a big clay pot, and you throw all the crushed grapes, stems and seeds and everything, you throw it all in a pot, you bury the pot, you wait a couple months, you dig it up, you've got wine. It's a very primitive wine, but they have these really cool varieties that don't exist anywhere in the world. And they have a winemaking style that doesn't exist anymore anywhere in the world. And entrepreneurs are flooding to Georgia to create new vineyards with the old style wines and the old style type of making wine. And wine tourists, if you're a wine snob, flooding going to Georgia to experiment with wines that just are really cool and interesting and different. I just brought a couple bottles. It's really neat. It's called Kyklos. It's a local grape. It's one of the local varietals, and it's a white wine, but it's almost bright orange, because that style of making wine turns it in, instead of being like a yellow like a normal white wine is, it's like an orange. It's a very strange color for wine, and the flavor is quite a bit different because it's a different type of grape, and then the style of making is different. So anyway. This is me in Gori. Stalin was Georgian. He grew up in a city. He was born in a city called Gori, and this is me at his house, which is a museum. And I'm giving him the finger. I'm not a nice guy. And this is us drinking and eating with friends. So Georgia's a great story. If you're a tourist, you want to go to Georgia, let me know. I'll hook you up. It's a great place. I just got back last week from Georgia. Neat stuff. All right, let's wind this towards a conclusion then. So we did a tour of current socialist countries, Cuba, Venezuela, sort of the border of North Korea. We went to past socialist countries like Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia. And it's pretty awful. Socialism's terrible. The statistics that are horrific. 100 million people at least died between Mao, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Stalin's purges. Stalin intentionally starved 15 million Ukrainians. We have at least 100 million murders. And if you don't get murdered, you lose weight, like Russia, or you have to wait in line. The picture that you have from the history of socialism is not a good picture. So why are people going around saying on polls they like socialism? I'm confused. Okay, so we decided to finish up the book by going to Chicago, of all places. We went to the Socialism Conference in Chicago. There's a Socialism Conference in Chicago every year in July. You can register for next July's conference right now. It's on your phone. You can give them your Visa card and they'll $150 registration fee. You can go to the Socialist Conference in Chicago next summer. We paid our money. We went to the conference. We weren't trying to be sly, or we weren't playing gotcha with the mostly young people. This is a picture of this conference. Pretty much normal conference, frankly. And we would ask people, hey, we're working on a book about socialism. Why are you a socialist? And we got strange answers. We got answers like, well, I'm a socialist because I'm against racism. I'm like, well, I'm against racism. Or I'm in favor of I want to have a better environment. I think we should do something about climate change. Actually, I do too. I think we should do something about the environment too. We should work harder on that. I had several people I talked to who were activists for immigration rights, for immigrant rights. I'm a libertarian, open borders guy. I'm like, I'm in favor of more immigration. I'd open the borders. So I was talking to these young people. I'm like, wow, they care about the same things I care about. But why aren't they socialists? Because the history of socialism didn't give us less racism. Cops weren't less racist in the Soviet Union, trust me. the environmental destruction that you can find in socialist countries, to this day, the leaking oil fields in Venezuela, it's washing up in Brazilian beaches right now. Massively bad historic record of environmental protection under socialist economies. So why were they socialist? Then we would even ask them directly, so you think we should get rid of private property? They're like, no, why would you do that? Well, because you're at a socialism conference, that's what it means. So there was this deep confusion on the part of the participants at a socialism conference about what socialism actually meant. So that was good news for me, actually. It's good news, because what I found was, I found a lot of young people who, if you want to call them social justice warriors, you could call them, I think it's a pejorative, that's mean. You had a lot of young people who saw injustice in the world and they wanted to fix it. And I'm like, good for you. I think we should fix injustice in the world. What I don't understand, and I still don't understand, is why they think socialism is a solution to these injustices. So that's the gap that I currently don't understand. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book. We wanted to try to maybe explain a little bit, say, hey, you know, these things you care about are important things. We should care about, we should do things about these. But total state control of the economy is not really going to be a solution to those things. Now, I'm going to finish up with a little fun story. This is the hotel lobby. It was a very nice hotel, privately owned, of course, is Hilton. There are no socialist hotels in Chicago, I don't think. Anyway, there's a brewery in Illinois. You may have, if you've been up there, you may have seen Revolution Brewery. It's the largest independent craft brewery in Chicago, and in fact in the state of Illinois. And it's Revolution Brewery. Their bar pull, their tap here is a raised fist, you know, with a red star. Although it's the Illinois Red Star, not the commie Red Star, but it's still a red star. So it's a raised fist with a red star. All of their labels, all of the beer names, they all have something to do with sort of revolution, socialist imagery, and things like this. I was on their website recently. There were 24 different beers listed on Revolution Brewery's website the last time I looked. And the irony, of course, is that Revolution Brewery, which is a private company in Illinois, and a for-profit company as far as I know, they make a greater variety and certainly better quality of beer than all the socialist countries in the world combined. This is an irony that I think is lost on the participants of this conference, and probably lost on the Revolution Brewery company, the people themselves. So that's our tour through the socialist economies. We try to have fun with it. It's a deadly serious topic, but even a deadly serious topic can involve some levity. And so it's kind of combining bar crawling, drinking stories. There's a couple prostitute stories because that's a thing in the world. It's not a thing just in socialist countries, though, so unfortunately. So, but anyway, that's the story of socialism. This is a little bit more. We did pretty well. We hit number 5 overall on Amazon. So I'm not going to buy a house with the money I'm going to make on this book. I might buy another Volkswagen Beetle with it. So stuff about it. But we hit number 5 overall. I'm more proud of the fact that we were number 1 in socialism and communism for many weeks. Actually, we were outselling Marx himself for several weeks. I was happy about that. And we also were number 1 in beer, which is weird because it's not a book about beer. It just got beer on the cover. So somehow or another, Amazon decided that we were going to put us in the beer category. So I felt bad for the people who wrote real beer books. We knocked them down on the rankings, and people who legitimately wrote cool books about beer, and we kind of got in there anyway. I felt sorry for them. I should send them. I should buy one of their books just to make it up to them. Anyway, that's the story of Socialism Sucks, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you. Yeah. How do we do this? Turn it up.
Slide the thing up.
There you go. Cool. Any questions? Do we want to go to Jordan?
So if this new trend that you first referenced is, as some hypothesize, the result of decades of K-16 education,
Percentage of the income is held by, a very large amount of income is held by a very small percentage of society, and everybody else is never ever going to get there, and so this may help equalize the playing field a little bit. Anybody talk about that?
Yeah, you certainly heard a lot of that.
Yeah.
Heard a lot of that. I mean, that's one of the clarion calls of socialists everywhere is equality.
Yeah.
I think they're factually mistaken. I mean, there was tremendous inequality in the Soviet Union. There is today tremendous inequality in Cuba, tremendous in Venezuela. I mean, there's no evidence that I've seen that it's actually true that socialism
Right.
equalizes these situations. In fact, I've got statistics on the Economic Freedom Index. Again, statistics are boring though. No one wants to listen to statistics, but I have data, which is very persuasive, that says that inequality is no better or worse in socialist countries than it is in capitalist countries. So I think it's one of the great myths out there. It's a deeply ingrained myth, but it's a myth that we need to work on trying to fix it. Unfortunately, the way I know how to fix that normally is use statistics, and no one wants to do it. No one's going to be convinced with a regression table, ever. So that's, again, where we came back to writing this style of book. We do talk about the difference between the elites and there were plenty of fancy new cars in Cuba. They were clearly government officials in those black Mercedes. There weren't very many of those either, but that tremendous inequality.
So during your visit to those socialism countries, so when it comes to the normal people, how do they feel about their socialism system?
Yeah, so in Venezuela, people were quite willing to talk about, I mean, what's it like? And they're like, you have no idea. They're like, again, if we just drove 3 days for food, they were willing to talk. If anything, it's worse than we conveyed probably in the book. It's certainly worse today than it was then when we went there. In Cuba, we did talk to a few people, but Cuba's not exactly a totalitarian Nazi Germany, but it's not a free political system, and so people were quite reluctant to talk about it. We initiated some conversations. My Spanish is just passable enough to talk about it, but most people were not willing to talk. We had a couple dissidents. We had phone numbers for a couple Cuban dissidents who were opponents of the government. We decided not to call them because, frankly, if meeting with us caused them to get arrested, I couldn't live with myself. So it would have been good for the book to talk to a Cuban dissident in Havana. It would have been great journalism. But I couldn't have lived with myself if something went wrong for the people we were talking to. So we didn't do it. We didn't pull that trigger. I had the phone numbers in my pocket the whole time. I just couldn't go to a phone booth, a local phone booth. Phone booth, I mean, they're all listened to. So, odds are the government bureaucrat listening to sleep. So you can probably get away with it. But, obviously, the Soviet people, I mean, they get plenty of, there's very little. You can run into old people who miss the old days, but that's only because they knew the old days, they knew how that system worked, they knew how the world worked, because now the world's completely changed today. Tbilisi's a radical different city today than it was in the old days. And the old people, it's upsetting to them. But anyone who talks about this stuff, they're like, gosh, they tell stories that's great, like, oh yeah, remember that time when the German butter came? Oh, that was great. Can you imagine being excited that you got butter? I mean, that was the world that they lived in. So, plenty of stories. Funny thing, there's all kinds of just weirdness, and so socialist countries are weird. If you ever go to Russia or Ukraine, or one of the former Soviet countries, ask people who are old, who lived in Soviet times, what did you study? It's either math or physics. It's like everybody is a mathematician or a physicist. They didn't have any plumbers. They didn't know how to grow food. Well, we made physics. And part of the reason was the Soviet planners just over-invested in some things and under-invested in other things, and they ended up with crap ton numbers of physicists and mathematicians. And of course, the world only needs, how many mathematicians and physicists do we need in the world? And they're all driving taxis now, or whatever, they're regular people. But again, the bizarre imbalances in the socialist economies. You put a small number of people, even if they mean well, they're just there's no way I can barely run my own life. Unless I was trying to run the lives of 100 million people or 300 million people in the case of the UN. So you just get strange things. So there are plenty of people who talk about it. Last story though, and we screwed it up, but there was a kid in Havana. We were walking up the steps, this big grand stairway to the University of Havana, the old colonial Spanish built university. And this young man was going down the steps, we were going up the steps, and just as he passed us, he said in perfect English, he says, "Where are you guys from?" Because it's obvious we're not Cuban, right? And perfect English is very rare in Cuba. It's really hard, if you don't have a pretty good Spanish, it's tough to go there. You can go to most Spanish-speaking countries and survive with English, but Cuba's not a lot of English. This kid spoke good English. And we're like, "We're from America." And he was like, "Oh, this is so great, you guys are, Americans are finally coming," because Americans are still pretty rare there, we're not allowed to travel freely still. So this is great, we're so happy Americans are coming, Obama came, this is great, you guys are gonna bring us more freedom, that's what he said. And that was one of the coolest things that's ever happened in my life, to see a Cuban kid excited that Americans are coming to his country, because he thinks we're gonna bring him more freedom. I'm not sure if we are, but that's what he thought. That was pretty cool. Then we let him walk down the steps, and we didn't, we should have asked him to go out for a beer. We didn't do that, so anyway.